Hi there. So today's podcast is about planning. We're going to be looking at the planning process in Ealing. Some would argue that it's broken in its current form. So, how does planning work? With me, we have Dr. Gerald Power from Stop the Towers and Will French, who's the chair of Save Ealing Centre and a retired planner who used to work with the government and the Royal Town Planning Institute. So, Gerald, first of all, I'm just going to come to you in a nutshell. How does planning work? How does it work? How does a developer get planning permission in Ealing?
Oh, now that you give me the easy question first, haven't you?
Yeah.
Well, I think I can summarize it in terms of what a developer would do for a major development is in some ways similar to what you'd do if you were kind of trying to do a big extension in your garden. You start with a pre-application engagement process and consultation where you'd go and talk to the interested parties and explain what you were trying to do and why and how, and get some feedback from them, which might mean that you might change what you were proposing slightly, or you might give up on the idea altogether. But that should mean that when you get to the next stage, which is putting in a formal application to the council for planning permission, that you've got a good idea how the stakeholders and your neighbours are going to feel about this and react. At that stage, you go into the formal planning process. People get the opportunity to put in comments through the planning portal or send them in writing or email them in. Councillors get a chance to have their say. Organisations like London Fire Brigade, water companies, sewerage companies, electricity companies, they'll all get a chance to comment on the plans. All those comments will come in. The developer will get a chance to revise their application during that stage of the process. And then it will get to the planning team who will do a formal report. And the planning team should be made up of planning professionals that will understand all of the relevant guidance and laws and local plans and their various precedences and how they fit in with each other. And they'll give a report to the planning committee, which is made up of ward councillors, who then have the discretion to accept or reject the application for planning. So they act like judge and jury on it. And the planning committee is drawn out of councillors from from all parties. It should be non-partisan. So in theory, you should get an apolitical process, based on analysis of the facts and the guidance. The reality is incredibly different from that.
Okay. We're going to go into that a bit more in a minute. But Will, first of all, I just want to say hi, Will. Thanks for joining us. Why is there so much development in Ealing? Because there's an awful lot going on. Some would argue it's becoming excessive, slightly out of control. Who's keeping tabs on how much development there is, and why is there so much development in Ealing?
The first question you asked was, why is there so much development in Ealing? The answer, more than anything else, is there's a lot of money to be made. Ealing is a popular area for developers. I think they're particularly keen here because there's a lot of planning consents to be granted. So they've gone out to places like Nipim in the south of France, where there's been big property fairs, and actually sold Ealing as a good place for developers to come and invest. And developers are promised, well, they hope that they'll make a lot of money through building new homes. And I think the Ealing Council encouraged them in the belief that they're not going to be as rigorous as some other boroughs in demanding other benefits through what's called the community infrastructure levy. So Ealing is a very popular place, and they've made themselves a very attractive place for residential developers of the sort that we've seen. Now, in theory, the council themselves are supposed to be reporting on the number of new planning applications that are had and the number of new homes that are being built. And they're supposed to be produce a report each year to say how they're getting on. And one of the great tragedies for us is that I think since 2013-14, there's been no reports, there's been nothing placed in the public domain in this borough to tell us how many new homes are being built. So actually, nobody really has a very clear idea on that at all.
Will, can I ask you, are there any developments, like you talked about the south of France, where they go and sell Ealing to all the developers? Would you say, are you allowed to say, are there any developments which have been pre-approved there before the planning application is put in, and then the planning application is merely a box-ticking exercise?
I think it would be going a bit far to say pre-approved, because the approval process has to be through the planning committee, and the planning committee sits in public. But what's happened in recent years is each year senior people from Ealing, as both the leader and also senior officers, go out there each year, host events, and they'll sit with developers and discuss proposals. A good example of what's happened was the old BHS development in West Ealing, where there's a very clear report in the House of Commons that the developers from that BHS site were led to understand they would have much more beneficial treatment than was originally expected under the local plan. That's been quite well documented now. So it's not a pre-approval in that sense, but I think there's an understanding that arises which helps, it carries through all the way through the process until the planning committee.
Okay, so Gerald, just back over to you. Talking about how the planning permission works, how the process works. It sounds pretty straightforward that it's scrutinised and then people write reports and then it's looked at through the planning committee. How much of this whole process do you think is known to members of the public?
Well, I think the answer is very little, and in reality, I think a very little of it is really known to ward councillors. And there is a difference between understanding the process as it's supposed to work and understanding how it genuinely works in practice. And the last year has been an incredible learning journey for me. I mean, my job in change management involves some pretty hairy and complicated projects, but when you start to look at the planning process, it takes on a whole new dimension in terms of complexity and also the ability to confound the process. And I think Will kind of alluded to that, the idea that in theory, a deal can't be done, things can't be pre-approved, but in practice, things happen that are pretty close to that, particularly when you see a local authority giving paid advice to developers and then marking their own homework when the application comes in. And similarly with the GLA giving advice to developers and then saying that they can make completely impartial judgments on whether a scheme should go ahead.
So, I mean, so members of the public are kind of trusting their local council to scrutinise these planning applications, but in actual fact, they're probably not scrutinising as much as they should. Is it safe to say
I think that's the key thing, Justine. That in this country, we have a massive tradition of believing in fairness and fair play and honesty and due process. And as citizens, as residents, we'll kind of put up with the most outrageous planning developments if we think it went through a fair and open process. And I believe that that's the impression that the council wants to give. They want to give the impression that it's fair and open and honest, when in reality, it's a long way from that.
Just talking about, a journey that we've just been on for the past, 14, 15 months, just ploughing through the volume of documents for the planning application. I mean, we've got quite a few smart people on our team, quite a lot of smart people on the Stop Towers team, but we've struggled to read some documents. So how is that for members of the public who haven't got, they haven't got the committee around them, they've got a great redevelopment on the doorstep, they want to try and fight it, they know it's wrong, it doesn't feel right, Does the language that the developers use need to be better, easier to understand, or is it just for people not to understand, so you just get bamboozled by it and you don't go near it? What do you think?
Over the recent years, there's been quite a cutback in planning officer staff. Austerity and so on has thinned out the numbers, and there's a lot of senior people have left the planning department. And that's encouraged more and more developers increasingly to get consultants to submit their supporting documentation. And those consultants are getting smarter and clever at what they do. So they present their planning applications in a way that very often is hard for even professional people really to read and understand, and to really get to the bottom of what's there. And it's even harder, I think, for people who are less experienced and less well qualified. So when you're presented with a big volume of very glossy documents that are produced well, the assumption is that the people who produce them know what they're doing, and they're doing it accurately and properly. And I think, to me, increasingly, it's part of a sleight of hand, it's essentially a sales document from a developer wanting to push through a scheme and really skating over the difficult areas. And it's hard sometimes for the public, but also I think for the planning officers to actually get to the bottom of it and actually properly bottom out what's there.
So the language the developers use and also the images the developers use as well in this sales pitch. We've all seen it, hiding tall 26-story towers behind a tree or a post box or, weird angles on the development just to hide the mass and density. Why are they allowing this to happen? Why is this, is there someone in charge to make sure we have good design and proper processes followed?
Well, I do want to clarify that they have increased the number of planners there, and I think they've got some quite experienced and very well qualified people there now. Another big issue, though, is that the planning department works under the Regeneration Directorate, and the Regeneration Directorate have not the same outlook that traditional planning development control people had. In more traditional planning establishments, the development control people stood a bit of apart and tried to take decisions on the basis of what they thought was the public interest. Now they're under the Regeneration Department. They're very much directed politically to produce results that the politicians want to achieve. And those results very often may not be the same as the long-term interests that more traditional development control teams used to have. So part of it is a change in the experience and the expertise, but part of it is also a much stronger political direction of the planning decision process than used to happen previously.
One thing that we were always concerned with when we spoke to councillors was a lot of the elected members didn't really understand the process, the planning process either, which is a worry. Any thoughts on that, Gerald?
Yeah, well, can I add to what Will said? Because I think that it's really important that idea that you can't entirely blame a planning team full of professionals where the number of people employed has been run down and down and down to the point where they're operating on a skeleton staff with a tiny budget, and they have to produce these reports. So they will do the absolute minimum, and also they will take the fewest risks possible. And that usually means saying yes to developers. And also I think it means that they're not really available to answer questions of elected members. So most of the elected members that we've consulted with were probably less well informed on the planning process than we were.
How much power does a local authority have, Gerald?
A very, very considerable amount of power. I mean, this is something we didn't realise until we consulted with some chambers, some barristers that specialise in planning law, and their very honest answer to us was generally a local authority can do whatever it likes in terms of interpreting planning law. The only point at which a court would want to get involved and even allow you to appeal it is if it looked out and out irrational. If it looked so crazy that it was completely irrational, then they might look at it. Up until that point, if the local authority can make an even vaguely plausible argument, then generally the courts will leave it alone and the authority can do what it likes.
So are there any conflicts of interest, Will? Do you know about any, can we talk about any conflicts of interest?
Well, let me just pick up Percival House, which I think is a current planning application, which I'm involved in trying to raise awareness of. Percival House is a development that Ealing Council land, which Ealing Council's gone into partnership with a developer called Vistry, and they put in a planning application which is current now. Now, landowner is also the planning authority. And so whether the landowner will get its way in extracting the maximum profit, or whether the planning authority's way of looking at what's in the best public interest, it's pretty easy to see, I think, that things will tilt towards the interest of the landowner, the council as landowner, rather than the council as a planning authority.
We're going to come back to that one in a minute as well. Gerald, would you say during lockdown, could you say that COVID has been exploited when it comes to the planning process? Yeah, for example, campaigning, planning committee meetings, getting out and getting the messages across from members of the public. What do you think about that?
I think the leader of the council has pretty much said it himself and is on video saying it, that they're trying to exploit COVID as best as they can to deliver their ends. They've paid lip service, I think, to continuing consultation, but right the way along it's been dogged. I mean, we've not really been allowed extra time to do community consultation when we're not allowed public meetings. A lot of the technology has not worked when meetings have happened. People have been left off copy lists. So I think lockdown has been exploited, and we see some very major tower developments coming through that certainly should have seen town hall meetings type consultations happening. And all we get is a few meager online webinars where you're not even allowed to ask questions. It's I think they are really not, they're just trying, I think they are clearly exploiting it to push through their agenda.
It does seem a bit ironic that during lockdown, the fact that these huge developments were being submitted for application during lockdown when people weren't actually allowed to get out and do anything. Gerald, has any of that happened? What we've talked about previously happened for the development on Manor Road, which is going to planning committee.
Oh, well, I mean, I think it's a checklist of nearly everything, in that it seems quite clear that the developers were in conversations with the GLA and Ealing up to a year before the first application went in. So they'd essentially agreed a design with the council before local people had any kind of whiff that there was even a development plan. Then it may well have even gone back further to the south of France and Mippin, and handshakes over dinner. I don't know, but it certainly felt that there'd been an enormous number of conversations that the local community had not been involved in. We tried to get some of the advice that's been given under freedom of information, but Ealing is refusing to give it, even at the point of the adjudicator ruling against them. They are still pushing back on that. So if we get that correspondence, it will be too late for this application. There are also lots of little niggles, and so we don't know quite who was doing it. But even at the outset of the consultation, neighbourhood posters were being cut down by people going around with knives. People in vans were paid to go around and clear things that were asking residents to come together and discuss the proposals, which we have no idea who did that, but it certainly started us all off on the back foot. And then the fact that when we did get access to information, it looked like the GLA was encouraging the developers to build higher and at higher density. You realise this is more about the GLA pushing its policy and the council pushing its policy than the developer. Yeah. So I'd say it ticks a lot of those boxes.
Yeah, I agree, because we suddenly had a meeting with a developer that literally told us, oh, by the way, you're getting a tower, and then when we scratched the surface and realised what had been going on, we realised that the conversation had been taking place for 3 years, and no one had told us, and it was all being pushed through. Very worrying indeed. So, Will, you touched on Percival House, so a bit more about that application very briefly. So it's a proposal for, is it 28 or 26-storey tower?
It's 26. Let me just go back to Manor Road, because I think that's a very interesting issue in its own right, in that, strictly speaking, decision-making is supposed to be based on what's in the adopted local plan. And the adopted local plan for Manor Road looks at, I think you may correct me, something like about a 4-storey building on there. And clearly, as you've been saying, discussions took place behind the scenes when developers were encouraged to believe that, despite what's in the local plan, that a tower would be acceptable. And they've gone right away there from a plan that went through all the proper examination processes and then has been ditched almost, it seemed to me, almost from the day it was first adopted. And I find that a loss of bad faith, because people got involved. People were very heavily involved in the preparation of the local plan, and they feel they've been completely betrayed by the outcomes of what's happened. If I can move on to Percival House, remind me the question. It was 26 stories high.
Well, I'm just going to say, I think that's absolutely right what you just said. People felt let down and disappointed with the local authority, because it's like, what is the point in having policy, specific site guidance, which you're not going to adhere to? The site hasn't changed.
Yeah, it's a matter. It's a real matter of trust in that the community engaged in good faith with the council, put in an enormous amount of unpaid hours to engage with that process and come to a local plan, and then the local authority has essentially told the developer, forget that, forget 6 stories, go to 28, and they didn't even have the good grace to go back to the community groups and say, we're going to advise to go higher, and this is the reason. There was no dialogue. It was a kind of Stalinist approach to planning that the GLA decided it's okay, so it's okay.
Yeah, and then here's a nice shiny flyer with our ginormous tower on it for you to get your head around. And it's like, what? That's, and then people say you can't do that because there's local plan, it's been decided, there's a site-specific guidance, and you think, thank goodness for that. And then someone says, which means nothing because no one cares anymore. Will, back to you. Percival House, what have we got? 26 or 28? Is it getting higher or is it lower?
It is 26. Again, the goalposts have moved there. When the council first entered into a development agreement with Vistry, who are the developers, Vistry put in a proposal for 20-story tower, and that went to cabinet when they were selected, that it would be a 20-story tower, which was lower, and this was one of the things that was supposed to have influenced the decision. It was lower than the competitor's 24-story tower. And then once the plans actually came out and we were consulted about them, that 20 stories had gone up to 26 stories. So they moved the goalposts continuously, and they always move them one way, and that's upwards. It's really what's happening on Percival House is very excessive. It's about half as dense again as the development on Dickens Yard. And if you go around Dickens Yard and you can see how cramped everything is there, it's going to be half as cramped again on Percival House if that goes through. It really exceeds all the limits. And if you were looking at it in any policy terms, you would say it shouldn't be approved. But
just to summarise, Percival House is the council's own building, which is 40 years old. So instead of refurbishing it, they're pulling it down, carbon footprint. They're now then going to build a new council's office, or they're going to put a library, and then they're going to put this huge housing estate. Is it 477 units, Will?
I believe so. I think
it's around that, over 400, over 450. And there's going to be shop units and cafes like the ones in Dickens Yard, which have laid empty for years. Is that right? And then a nice little pedestrian walk through across Longfield Road or Longfield Avenue onto empty roads, empty cafes and empty shops on Dickens Yard.
Historic England have objected strongly. They say it's going to impact badly on the character of Ealing Town Centre. And I think their criticisms may make Ealing think again.
It will also impact on the views from Pitsanger Manor, which is obviously, it's a listed building. It's been recently refurbished. Julian Bell's a trustee of that manor. I'm just very surprised that, I just wonder what the people at Pitsanger Manor think of that. So just going to move on very quickly. Any other examples of these bad developments? I mean, Gurnell's one that we always talk about, building huge amount of tower blocks and a great big concrete development on top of a floodplain.
Well, I think Gurnell is a classic. I'm not an expert on that, but I was a regular fan of Gurnell as a sports and leisure centre. And I mean, having talked to the people that have been objecting to this, the council has refused consistently to give any of the financial information or any of the information about the design life of the building, just expecting everybody to accept that the building was beyond any kind of sustainability and had to be demolished. And again, refusing to give any information on the financials of the deal. First of all, we were going to get a brand new leisure centre built by the developer, then we weren't, then we might get something, now we don't know. And now it feels like the council has decided to shut the leisure centre down and force the issue. So yes, I think Gurnell's a classic.
I think what sort of gets, it's all being done in our name. It's being done in the name of the Ealing community. And the Ealing community is squealing quite loudly that actually they think they're going the wrong way. And Gurnell is a very good example of that. Most people in Ealing don't want Gurnell redeveloped. They like the They like the swimming pool as it is now, and they don't see why it should be developed.
You could just refurbish Canal. You could just spend some money on refurbishing it.
Well, I mean, Justine, I don't think we should get bogged down in the particular one, but with Gurnell, I think the big issue that there was no meaningful consultation. There was no sharing of any of the relevant information. It was just dropped on us as a fait accompli with no real way to object. And then by closing it, they will probably argue it's not economic to reopen it. And again, it forces it further. It just creates a derelict site.
Southall Gasworks?
Well, I think that's one about community engagement. And I mean, I'm not an expert on that one, but also I think, and I may well be wrong on this, but I think it also implies a weakness in Ealing's planning team, because that was a difficult site. That's a former gasworks site. It's potentially full of toxic metals, toxic organic chemicals from the gasworks operation. Redeveloping it was going to be a very difficult task, a bit like redeveloping the Olympic site. But obviously the developer got it very wrong, and Ealing didn't spot that. And the local community has been campaigning for nearly 2 years now about the effect of toxic fumes and toxic dust from that development. But Ealing seemed completely unable and unwilling to intervene.
I think the issue with it is that Ealing is the Environmental Health Authority. They are the people who are supposed to be protecting the environmental health of people who live in this borough. And the people who live in this borough include the people who live in Southall, and they've been complaining very loudly about the effects of the cleanup that's happening. And Ealing seems not to have the capacity to intervene.
If you run down your planning team and you make it very, very weak, then you've got nothing to stand up against the politicians, or nothing to be able to afford you the expert advice that councillors and communities might need.
So if we were to summarise, Will, how would you summarise Ealing's planning system?
I think it's lost the trust of the community who feel it should be serving. And I think it needs to go back. We need to get a new local plan. We need to get proper reporting on what's happening. And I think we need to get back in touch with local people. That's what's got lost.
I personally worry that by the time that happens, there'll be so many things would already been pushed through development. There'll be so many towers built. So the place will be, I just don't think recognise it. Gerald, can you summarise?
Well, I would go further than Will. I'd agree with him, but I would say that it's been deliberately broken. It's not broken in an accidental way. I think it's been deliberately broken because it was getting in the way of the ambitions of elected politicians locally and at the GLA. They had agendas. They wanted a particular type of development. They wanted to push it aggressively. The planning process was getting in the way. So I think that the planning process has been systematically eroded and broken down, and it has destroyed trust. And I think at the moment, if we want to take back control of the borough and get some sensible planning, we've just got to get rid of the current politicians, because they have so much power, and they've hobbled the process so much that I think the only way back to any kind of sense is get rid of them. This has become a political issue, not a planning issue. Essentially, if the councillors will not actually take responsibility for planning and hide behind a process which they know has been led astray and weakened, they need to go. And I think that's a really sad state of affairs, but I think that's where we're at. And I include the GLA very much in that, because the GLA has been standing in the wings on all this with the ability to intervene, and has only done so to support the developers. As soon as people realise that the borough's being sold out from underneath them, that they're losing amenity and value in their homes, and that these things are being imposed on them, then maybe they'll wake up and start voting in that way. But I think the politicians understand very well that as long as it's always seen as a local issue, it's this library, it's that sports centre, it's this block over there, it's something over there in Southall, nothing to do with us. If they pick us off individually, they know they can continue doing this indefinitely. It's only when we actually start to wake up and realise this is a systematic pattern, and act accordingly and get together and vote them out, then I don't think it is going to change.
Thank you, Gerald. Will, have you got anything else to say on the subject, or are you happy you've kind of...
Well, there was one point I want to make, is that the amount of development and the speed that's happening is going to impose a lot of long-term costs, all sorts of ways, new increase in population, increasing congestion, all sorts of issues. and somebody in the future is going to have to pay those costs. So I think the breakdown in planning is actually, in the long run, it's going to be impact on us all. It's going to lower all of our quality of life, and that's why I'm fighting it as hard as I can.
Yeah, it's quite telling that we've got an incredible program of developing ultra high density tower housing across the borough, which we hear a lot about. But I've not seen a single plan for adding an extra dentist or GP surgery. It's just not part of what's being considered.
I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you, Will, and thank you, Gerald. Thank you for your time.
Right, thanks, Justine. Thanks, Will.